And it's interesting, in an awful lot of classic community development, we just think about one species. There are 30,000 species on the planet, but we are so profoundly arrogant as humans that we think we're the most important. And actually thinking about wellness and health in terms of how it relates to our ecology is hugely important. Absolutely, I can't emphasize the importance enough. So not just thinking about the ecology of the people, the networks in the life of the person, but also the species that aren't human, the physicality of the place, which is profoundly significant for people, the economics of their life. All of those things matter hugely, as well as obviously the systems. So yeah, ecosystem seems a really important thing to pay attention to. Ashley?
I think we made a really strong message around village, and that, you know, that's quite a distant concept for us working in London. But in fact, we are made up and live within a whole series of villages, and kind of really struck me around how do we really support the people that we currently connect with to think a bit differently about where they live and who they contact with. That struck me big. The other big challenge I was left with was around the outcomes that you were talking about. That actually, we've moved quite a way in some areas where our work's commissioned from a kind of series of outputs to actually really working on outcomes. But there's a real challenge, isn't there, that actually, if we're going to work on individual outcomes, then we don't quite know where we're going. We're not kind of going, that's the kind of that will describe the kind of organisational achievement and demonstration to commissioners and so forth that we're doing what's required. And actually it's going to take a very big shift both in their bravery but in ours as well to challenge some of that, to actually say, actually this is about individual outcomes and we're listening to the people we're serving rather than to the voice of the kind of purse holder or commissioner.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And also how some of the outcomes at neighbourhood level may be shared by many other individuals that you're not necessarily serving at all. In fact, most likely that you're not. But it's only because the individual that you serve gets connected with 20, 30 other people and does something about the 11 bus being late for older people that they get well. And this whole challenge, turns so many sacred cows on its head. This idea that actually as individuals we're not sick in a well world, but as individuals we're seeking to be well in a sick world. And so some of this is an organizing issue rather than a therapeutic issue. It's a community building challenge rather than a service provision challenge. And both are important. We have, if you weigh things in terms of how do I spend my day, my energy, my time, my investment, my intellectual resource, there will be some stuff that you'll do that will weigh in the scale of service provision. And there'll be some stuff that you do which is around community building or enabling community building. The difficulty is that currently our imbalance is so tremendous, so great, that it's hard for people to even know where to start, So that's what I want to pay attention to today, is if we were to do more of the community building stuff, if you, as an organization called Certitude, were to find a way of helping people to identify, connect, and mobilize their assets up to a point where they reach the limit of local, where they need help from outside, and then beyond, what would you do that you're not currently doing? And what would you stop doing that you are currently doing to make more of that stuff happen? That's the journey that I want us to go on. That's what, between now and 3:30, I want us to begin to wrestle with. We don't have to obviously figure it all out, but what I want to try and do is to begin to situate the conversation in a place of importance. Because currently my view is, in terms of mental health, it's a peripheral conversation. It's interesting. We find it intriguing. The disruptive innovators, what I call the Trojan mice, are really interested. They want to put their crash helmets on and go into the citadel, find the cracks. But actually for most people, it's neither central nor strategic to be talking about this idea of helping people get connected. Not just in any old network, but in a network of place where you can create density and enduring change. So that's the piece. And I think just to make it really simple, even though it's not simple at all, but just to, I suppose, give us a fixed target, if you like. There are 3 questions that we're going to try to wrestle with. The first is, when you think about mental health or health generally, when you think about being well, right? So that's being sick less often and recovering more quickly when you are, that kind of thing. What is it that only citizens can do, that folk, non-credentialed, non-professional, non-system institution folk can do to be health producing, that no professional, no matter how well resourced, no matter how well trained, no matter how great their leadership is, can replace? What is that? And I really want to get clarity on that, because I think if we're not clear on that, what we do is we assume it doesn't exist. What we don't see, we don't value. And the difficulty is that citizen competency, when it comes to being productive in the world of mental health, isn't really valued because it isn't very visible. So there's something about just getting clarity on that, it's seeing the invisible and actually recognizing it's abundant. Does that make sense? So that's the first thing I want to do. And then sequentially, and I'm being very, very intentional about the questions here, because that's part of what we have to do as leaders. It's not just about asking the right questions, it's about asking the right questions in the right sequence. So the next question is once we're clear about what it is that individuals, their family, their kin, their friendship network, and their wider network of neighbors can only do, for which there's no replacement, what is it on top of that that they could do more of if they had a little bit of help from outside? Now, typically that help is really, really, really very cheap, very low grade. It's more like Nicholas was saying earlier on, it looks more like coaching than support. It's not big machinery, it doesn't cost a lot of money. In fact, a lot of the time what you're doing is trying to get out of the way. Okay, so what does that look like? And how could we build on what you're already doing to enable some of that stuff to happen, but also innovate around the edges? What other funky, interesting, mischievous things could we do that would create the enduring relationships that we want? So I'm intentionally saying to you, right, let's not start with co-production as our starting point. Co-production comes after the community building. You can't get co-production by simply saying, let's pretend that the non-credentialed people, when we bring them to the table, are really going to be our partners. Because the truth of the matter is, this is highly political, but the truth of the matter is most people who've been medicalized or been excluded from the mental health journey, or indeed their wider community, even if they are brought to the table, do not feel like they're your partners. So there's a journey around doing something about that. Partnership in this country is code for the mutual suppression of loathing in pursuit of government funding. And the truth of the matter is that partnership is where everybody who comes to the table brings something of equal value. So we can't bring something as equal value as ordinary, regular peeps as folk unless we know what it is. And sometimes that means that the professionals who, in our world, are more credentialed, more important, dress better, talk better, have to kind of intentionally move back and depopulate and decolonize the space so that I can step into that power. Against the narrative that says, the only thing that I can bring that's of any use is my pathology. That's my most valuable thing. My mental ill health actually creates jobs. I am an investor in the economy, right? To a point where I come in and I say, I'm a primary investor in my own mental health, well-being, however you frame it, and my family are co-conspirers. Even if they're a bit weird. I sometimes open my mouth and my mother comes out, you know, and it's embarrassing. We get all of that. It's just with all of the frailty, with all of the dysfunctionality that makes us who we are as human beings, how do we get in the action as primary investors? So that's why I say co-production comes after the community building. And we're creating a fantasy if we say otherwise. Currently, co-production in this country has 3 major problems attached to it. 1, it tends to be driven by professionals. Right? That's not co-production, right? That's co-design. The second is we're talking with individuals. So we're designing stuff with individuals rather than actually designing stuff that involves individuals and their ecosystem and us. We often use terms to try to describe that, like catalyst. Now, catalyst in scientific terms means something that acts on something else without changing itself. Not a good word to use. We have to change. That's part of the new call to leadership, is to recognize that our humanity is the skin in the game. And if we're thinking about people as those that need our help and us, the helpers, we are creating the perfect environment for abuse of power to occur. The moment that a helper thinks that the help has nothing to offer them, you're in an imbalance of power where bad things can happen. It is a safeguarding issue in the real sense of safeguarding. So how do we do something about that? Now that's real co-production. And creating the ambiance and the mood music within which we can dance that dance is really a challenge that goes to the very heart of what we mean by leadership. And then once we figured all that stuff out, then we can actually say, and now, what's left for us? What is it that remains that only a professional, credentialized, expert person can do? Now, I don't want to set up any artificial polemics here, and I'm going to just talk for a few minutes to set the scene, and then we'll spend largely an hour or more in exercises. But I don't want to set up the artificial polemic of community good, institution bad, you know, and then have some kind of a battle go on for the next hour and a bit. That's not what I'm talking about. Bottom line is, I flew last night from Glasgow to Gatwick. Eventually I got off the plane. Eventually I got on the plane. Then eventually I got off the plane. They lost my bag. And it was a wonderful sort of experience of where systems are limited. But I got here. And there's a lot that I appreciated about the idea of being a passenger on a plane. You've got to kind of appreciate the way the world is organized sometimes. And when it comes to, it's Flybe, I think, no, EasyJet I flew with last night, I lose track. So I flew with EasyJet, and they have everything worked out in a really nice, systematized way. I am clear that I'm a consumer, and pretty much that I'm going to be treated the same as everybody else. So they don't pretend that I'm a citizen. They just treat me like a customer, and I kind of like that. You know, you can imagine how freaky it would be if the pilot came over the airwaves and said, I've just done an ABCD program and I really recognize all of you as citizens. Honestly, let's all just co-produce this flight. I've got about 50,000 buttons. To be honest, I haven't a clue which one to press. Why don't you just have a little, maybe World Cafe, a little conversation among yourselves. And while you're at it, let's decide where we go to. The world is your oyster. You know, you wouldn't be happy unless you were going to hijack the plane. So, you know, there are times when you want to be in a consumer mindset, you want to be in a consumer context, right? But there are also times when you want to be a citizen, when you want to be the producer of your own reality, your own day-to-day existence. And I think we're really struggling as a culture across Europe, as cultures across Europe, we're really struggling to get clarity about when we have which going on. So we're really very, very confused, is my sense of it, around the social contract, around what it is that only citizens can do, what it is they need help with, and what it is that only institutions can do. Now, clearly, there's a role for institutions. But because we spend so much time and so much money and so many leadership programs talking about the role of institutions, here's a radical thought. Let's not talk about them today. Let's just put them to one side and let's pay attention to the community alternatives to the system and the institution. Not because the institution doesn't matter, of course it does, but because it's the only way we can really get into this so-called invisible space with any degree of clarity. So that's what I'm going to try and do. I'm going to spend about the next 10 minutes now just sharing some stories with you that hopefully will set the scene, and then we're largely going to try to figure out the answers to these few questions. A couple of stories to begin with, as much as anything else, just to set the ambiance of the room. So the first story that I want to tell you is a story that it's to be honest, it's more of a parable than a story. And it's the story of the 18th camel, okay? And I think this story is very useful insofar as it just reminds us of what we really mean by an asset-based approach to being helpful. So as the story goes, somebody who worked for years in the mental health profession retired. This was, in the time when you retired, you got a really nice package. Those days are long gone. But they retired, they got a nice package, and they decided that they were going to treat themselves. They'd worked very, very hard all their lives, and they were going to go on their own and have a really exotic holiday. So they went to a desert because that was their thing. It was on their bucket list. It was something they wanted to do. They went to a desert and they got themselves a camel. And they essentially decided they were going to try and traverse the desert on a camel. And after about 3 days of traveling on this camel, they came to the edge of an oasis. And as this person looked, he saw at the edge of this oasis 3 brothers weeping unconsolably. So being a compassionate person, he dismounted his camel and he walked over to the brothers and he said, "Why are you crying?" And the eldest of the 3 of them said, "Well, our father passed away a couple of days ago." And so the man who was riding the camel said, "I'm really sorry to hear that. Please accept my condolences." And anyways, the conversation went on. The eldest brother started telling this camel rider what had happened just before his father passed away. Apparently, before his father passed away, he left in his last will and testament a very, very clear set of instructions around how the worldly possessions, his remaining worldly possessions, were to be divided out. So his last will and testament was that all his worldly possessions would be divided out, with a half of the worldly possessions going to his eldest brother. This is where you really got to pay attention. You know this kind of slump after lunch where you eat, you start to, don't fall into that. So a half of all his worldly possessions had to go to the eldest brother, and then a third had to go to the second eldest, and finally the youngest guy fared out worst of all. He only got a ninth, as often happens in such traditions. So the guy who retired from the world of mental health was, so what's the big deal? And the eldest brother said, well, the big deal is the guy popped his clogs, our father popped his clogs, and before he popped his clogs, he had only got 17 camels to his name. Now try and do the maths on that. You can't, right? Unless you take a chainsaw to the equation. So he said, we're really frustrated because in our culture, to not be able to honor the dying wish of your father is really not a good thing. But now here you see, this is the beauty of this story, I think. Here you have this person who spent his entire working life in the world of mental health, of thinking about mental well-being, of problem solving, of coaching people, of nudging people, of really helping people figure things out. Terrific leader. Absolutely at the top of his game, right up to the day he retired. And he immediately could see the solution. So he said to the brothers, I've got it cracked. Take my camel, right? Easy. 18 simples, you're away. But the brothers said, the eldest brother was speaking for the others, but the others agreed with him, said, our father has raised us to never accept anything from an outsider. Anything. I get this regularly, you come in and to people that you're speaking to say, who's your man think he is? To tell, it's probably going on downstairs. We do this stuff already. Who's your man thinking? So, same reaction. Never accept anything from outsiders. So they said thanks, but no thanks. But this guy, this professional, he was really, really well trained in negotiation, conflict management, and nonviolent communication. And so he said, well, what if I was to convince you that actually I won't be diminished by my gift to you, and neither will you? That in fact, I will leave with exactly what I had, and behind me I will leave you with exactly what you had. And that's kind of confused them. They were so bamboozled and so curious that they couldn't resist taking the 18th camel. And so accordingly, they took the gift. Now, another bit of maths. So now we have 18 camels, right? Now let's see if we can fulfill the father's wish. So the eldest brother gets a half of 18, which is 9. The second guy gets a third, which is 6. And then the final guy fares out the worst of all. He only gets a ninth of 18. 9 into 18 is 2. So 9 and 6 and 2, bingo, 17. And away walks this very, very smart professional. with his camel, right? Now, I think this is the leadership challenge. Where is the 18th camel? What is the 18th camel in this organization, right? What is it? And that's the question. I told this story 3 years ago. I meant to share this with you over lunch, Bex. I told it. Bex is a colleague of mine's with me, with us today as well. Right here. I told this story in Amsterdam 2 years ago, and I just discovered the other day that there's now a movement called the 18th Camel. So never doubt the power of stories, right? Not an organization, a movement, right? So what's the 18th camel for you and your organization? That's something that I think, I think you could probably wrestle with for the rest of your life quite happily. But what is it? What does it look like? Well, one of the people who really wrestled with that question, what is the 18th camel, was a man by the name of Jerome Miller, who wrote a book called Last One Over the Wall. And basically, he was a criminologist, and he was brought in the late 70s by the mayor of the governor of Massachusetts in response to a tremendous amount of crises around the institutions that were incarcerating young kids who'd committed various crimes. So they called them juvenile reformatories at the time. And when Jerry came in, his primary sort of focus was, well, can I stop the abuse, right? Can I make it so that these are safe places for kids to be in? And being a scientist, the first thing he did was he did a baseline. So let's look at the current reality, okay? Not just in terms of the level of abuse, but let's try and see, well, what's the level of recidivism? As kids leave these places, how many reoffend, how quickly? What's happening at that level? So he took a baseline, and then he spent about 2 years across Massachusetts. He did this in other jurisdictions as well, but across Massachusetts, he spent about 2 years really trying to use the classic tools of reform. So retraining staff, doing leadership programs, making sure there was good supervision, all really important things. And actually, very, very successfully got to the point with a lot of really powerful HR and rooting people out as well if they weren't in the right jobs, where he had reduced abuse almost to non-existence. And after 2 years of that reform, he went back to his baseline, right? The recidivism, which means the level of repeat offense. And he measured the level of recidivism of the kids who were coming out of a system that was non-abusive in the institutional sense, as against the kids who were coming out of the system that was abusive. And guess what he discovered? There was no difference. The level of recidivism remained. So now he had empirical evidence that the best thing that the system could do for these children was the worst thing that could happen to them, even if it reformed itself. Now, this is really important because immediately it makes it sound as though the system is the bad guy. And that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, it's a bit like, you remember that scene at the end of The Wizard of Oz? Where, Dorothy's kind of done the hard-to-reach stuff. They kind of got the at-risk lion and all of that onto the yellow brick road and promised if they just came to the Emerald City that the wizard would solve all their problems, right? That narrative. And then Toto the dog, who's pretty much irrelevant throughout the whole movie, suddenly comes in to be the primary sort of hero and pulls back the curtains. Do you remember this? And behind the curtains, this ordinary man, effectively, kind of maneuvering levers and whatnot. And Dorothy steps forward and she says to him, because she's kind of angry, she's made a lot of promises. I mean, there's a lot of outcomes committed here. Commissioners are not happy, right? And she says, "You're a bad man." And he responds and he says, "No, I'm not a bad man. I'm just not a very good wizard." I think that's a great act of leadership, isn't it? Say, we're not wizards. There are things that we cannot do. One of the great acts of leadership is to talk honestly about your limits, while at the same time talking about the person's capacities that you serve. It actually is a two-step. It's not just about talking about the capacities. It's also about saying, here's the space beyond which we cannot go. That actually, if you don't do something in this space, it won't get done. Imagine that message, that there's a bundle of stuff around mental health, and if you don't do it, it won't get done. So that's what I'm kind of talking about. Jerry started to realize that the system had limits. He also realized that the system was spending a heck of a lot of money on these kids. Even in the late 70s, on average, it was spending around $70,000 incarcerating and often abusing young boys. I mean, it seems harsh to say that, but effectively, that's what was happening, right? So he started to think about, you know, well, I've been given a mandate by the governor to be radical, right? And radical means to go to the root of the problem, not just to, you know, get an award for being radical. I mean, I hear people, the 50 radicals and so on and so forth, and I look at what they're doing in the UK, and it doesn't seem terribly radical to me. I think it's radical design, but it doesn't seem like a radical thing to do for the most part. But this guy, I think, deserves the name radical. And there are a few in the UK who are radical. But I think he deserves the name radical because he didn't do the tinkering. He didn't do the reform piece. He said, you know what, now I've got evidence that the most radical thing I can do is pay attention to what happens outside the limits of the system. The most radical thing I can do is to seek out the community alternative to institutionalization and incarceration of our children. And he turned his face to community, away from the professional world, away from the allopathic medical world, and he said to communities, so guys, here's the rub. We waste $70,000 a year incarcerating kids, and we think we pretty much failed. What would you do that would allow these kids have a life of their own choosing and actually learn how to be pro-social? And there are lots and lots of stories. You could read the book in your own time, and I would really commend it to you. But there's lots of stories I could share. The one that I most like, I guess, I have most affection for, is the Pan Am story. So in the late 70s, around the time that Jerome Miller was actually actively inviting, not third sector organizations, but ordinary, non-credentialed folk to come forward with ideas around what they could do to ensure that these young people had a life. Students from universities all over Massachusetts started coming forward and suggesting that Jerry give them the money to buy a round-the-world ticket from Pan Am. Now listen to this. I mean, this is you'll understand what I mean when I say radical on this one, right? So basically, Pan Am were the first airline in the world to offer around-the-world tickets. They're commonplace now, but at the time, around-the-world tickets. So it cost $3,000. You could buy your ticket and you could travel around the world, get off 3 times, or indeed 70, 80 times if you wanted to, and spend the year going around the world. So many of these students just came forward and said, you know what, here's the proposal, right? You can imagine writing a kind of a funding application like this. So here's the proposal. What we want is we want you to give us $3,000 for ourselves to buy our ticket, give us another $3,000 to buy the ticket for the young person that we're going to bring with us, and give both of us about $5,000. We won't stay in fancy places, but enough to eat and to stay in reasonably good places. We'll take that young person off your hand and we'll see you in a year. We won't write any reports. It wasn't, you know, there wasn't Facebook at the time, so we will not see you for a year. You might get a letter, but that's it. And pretty much every single individual who was previously incarcerated, who went on that journey, had transformed at the end of it. Their life was transformed. But also the students' lives were transformed. And it was a fraction of the cost of the institution. Now, that's what I mean by radical, a radical bureaucrat, who can actually think about the community alternative when everybody, including the people around him, are saying, the solution doesn't exist in the community, it exists among the hegemony of the professionals, the ones that know, right? So that's what I mean by radical. And I think it's really important to lift that story up because Jerry didn't come up with a set of programs. You know, the classic thing then is you get a load of designers in, right? And they say, so that's the solution. We need the Pan Am program. Let's design the Pan Am program. And you know, you get to a point where, now, for maximum impact, it's really important that the ex-offender sits in seat 6D. It's really important because our research shows that when that happens, you know, a certain part of the brain fires. Yeah. Come on. The music, the magic, the emergence happens because people get in relationship with each other, we trust them, and away it goes. But how many radical bureaucrats, how many radical leaders in the world of the professional do we know who would take that kind of risk? Not that many. Well, that's the challenge, I think. Another leader, and I'll share this and then we'll maybe go into some discussion. Another leader that I want to point to is a man by the name of Jim Deers, who's looking very blue in that picture. But he's far from blue. He's effervescent. He's one of these characters who lights up a room when he's in it. But Jim was the city or director of Seattle City Department of Neighborhoods. Back in 1988, he was appointed to the role. And essentially, before that, he was a community organizer in the Saul Alinsky style. I don't know if you're familiar with that approach, but basically, the Saul Alinsky style of community organizing is where you get people really good and angry. You know, you rub the sores of discontent until they bleed. Find a good common enemy, and then, you know, muster the community against that person. So, before the mayor called him up, Norm Rice, I think, was the mayor at the time, and said, "Jim, will you come and head up my new Department of Neighborhoods?" Jim had released a live chicken in his office because he'd welched on a campaign promise. I said that recently in Cardiff, and I was nearly booed off the stage. Apparently, you know, but anyway, the city offered Jim the job. And as he'd say himself, if he was here, he couldn't spend his time releasing live chickens in the offices of his employers. So he had to figure out something he could usefully do. And I just want to share 3 things with you before I stop speaking, essentially, and then open up to discussion. So the first thing I think he did that mattered really significantly was that he started recognizing that they had 32 different departments in Seattle City Council, or city government. And essentially each of those departments dealt with different things, as you'd expect, from recreation to sanitation. And he started to realize that was kind of part of the problem, that they were centralized and they were siloed by function. And largely it meant, as I said this morning, that people had to organize themselves the way that system was organized to get any kind of a quality service at all. So he said, well, why don't we organize our system the way people organize their lives? And typically, though there are lots of different ways that people organize their lives, but typically most people organize in neighborhoods. You know, we have different words for it. We might call it a village, we might call it a set of streets, we might call it an estate. But, you know, where people physically, in geographical terms, live. So he said, well, what would happen if we began to try to organize our council so it started to look much more like the neighborhood, much closer to the neighborhood, had sympathy and worked with the grain of people's lives rather than expecting them to work with our grain. And he set up the Department of Neighborhoods, and out of that came what he calls city halls, little mini city halls that went into these neighborhoods and made it so that people could actually engage with city government at a human level. They actually got to know local people who were employed as what he would call overt double agents. So they had a responsibility of occupying the gap between the institution and the community. Their job was to be bilingual and bicultural, to help that mediated space so that people could actually begin to not alone articulate what their needs were, not by silo or function, but in the round, but could also have meaningful conversations about what other solutions existed within and around them. The second thing he did was he redefined how we think about funding. So he said, well, why is it that every time somebody wants money to do something in the community, that the first thing we say to them is, well, do you fit our funding criteria? Which is pretty much the same as saying, we know what's good for you, and we're going to officiate and monitor your compliance around those sets of criteria. Instead, he said, well, what if we worked on the basis that people themselves know what's best for them? And if we could find a way of enabling them, when they do need some resource from outside, to do that, but on the basis that they're coming to the table with their passion, with their commitment intact. So he did that by saying, well, why don't we actually put a value on social capital? Why don't we, instead of saying, well, we've got all the money and all the resources and you've got all the problems, why don't we say to people, if you can identify with 3 or 4, however many neighbors, something you really want to do, and pledge a number of hours to doing that, which would be just on a guesstimate, we'll value that at $10 an hour, and then we'll match that with another currency that just so happens to be money. So we will see the currency of social capital as having more value actually than the cash match. The cash match comes second, but it will enable you to do anything from trimming your neighbor's hedge to something a little bit more radical, like creating a neighborhood plan, for example, which would include some thinking around mental health and mental well-being. Totally changed things. Between 1988 right up to recently, about 20 years, $50 million was invested in enabling people to do these micro, local, hyper local street level projects. And out of that, $88 million worth of sweat equity, social capital, was leveraged. Now, can you imagine this? Not alone was that leveraged, but hundreds of thousands of people who would have never gotten involved in the old way of doing business, the old style of community development, that's why I think it's so important to call it community-driven development, right? Are now engaged. Are now engaged. And are engaged in all kinds of things that they themselves are self-directing. We know from a psychology point of view that language acquisition is enhanced when we follow the initiative of the child, right? So when the child looks at the light and the parent says, you're looking at the light, 100 times or more, the child learns the word light. Well, communities and people are exactly the same. When we follow their initiatives rather than expect them to follow ours, enduring change results. And it's the same for mental health. So how do we create that kind of condition? Well, if we're spending money, and I guess organizations like you are big enough to spend some, well, it's beginning to think about how you might use a match, which starts with people's passion first and then uses money secondarily. The other thing I would say to you, I often joke with people, and it's a bit of a tease, but there's a seriousness to it, that organizations like yours spend quite a lot of money on toilet roll. It's true. So, you know, not enough, but a lot, okay? And it is tongue-in-cheek. But actually, if you added it up in terms of leadership, it's a lot of money, right? And I would guess that most of that toilet roll is sourced, albeit at some kind of local, I guess, wholesales. But it's essentially coming from somewhere not of this community, or not of the communities we serve. It's being mass-produced somewhere by some monolithic commercial entity, right, that makes a shed load, I said shed, of money out of us purchasing, I guess on the basis of procurement regulation, the cheapest toilet roll. But imagine if as an organization we said, you know what, actually our corporate social responsibility from now on isn't to go and paint a local school once a year, but it's to figure out how we could enable local communities to be the producers of toilet roll that we consume. I mean, just by way of, for example. Now that to me is real community development, because that's putting pounds in people's pockets, right? Real life job-based opportunities. And it's starting to recognize that actually mental health is political. And it's economic. I mean, somebody asked me recently, you know, if I had a choice between an asset-based approach becoming global and everybody having a basic universal income, you know, like a citizen income, which would I choose? Hands down, without any argument, I would choose the income. If we could create a scenario whereby everybody, instead of getting benefit, had a basic income that was their right, and that they could do whatever they liked to top it up, using their own enterprise and skill, we would have a completely different conversation about mental health. And I think, actually, a very different conversation about how our organizations get structured. So thinking about that is really important. And I think that's something that Jim proffers. The third thing that he did, I think, which is really quite helpful, was just to really say place matters. We as organizations, for a lot of reasons, get very, very focused in on target groups and on areas of interest, you know, whether it's programmatic interventions or whatever it might be. But this radical idea that actually place is where our health and well-being, including our mental health, are most likely to come together. It's most likely going to flourish there. It may not necessarily look like the most attractive place at the moment because there's lots of work to be done. But that is the place of most possibility. It's the place where if you were looking for investment potential, I would certainly encourage you to look. So there are just some thoughts to kind of seed the conversation. What I'd like to do now, if it's okay, is I'd like to invite you to find two other people in the room that for whatever reason you may not necessarily get to work with as much as maybe some of the people you're sitting beside. So some people that you'd like to get to know a bit better and maybe co-conspire with. And we're going to work in groups of 3 to start looking at these 3 questions that I'd mentioned earlier on. So really start thinking about what is it that is within the unique competency of citizens around mental health, and really spending time on that, grappling with that, wrestling with that, challenging some of our own limiting beliefs around that as well, yeah? And trying to generate a little bit of an inventory of what they are. And then the other questions, well, what is it that only institutions can do? And then finally, what does co-production really look like? So we're going to spend a little bit of time on that. It's 1:30 now. It's 2:30 now, excuse me. So let's, man, he does talk. So let's spend a little bit of time. Let's spend about 15 minutes really trying to dig into that question, because I think what that will allow us to do is then go on to the next section, which is, well, based on that, what are we going to start doing and what are we going to stop doing? So between those 2 exercises, what I want to get to in the next half hour is a set of recommendations around the way forward. So let's start by terrain mapping. Let's start by looking at those 3 domains, okay? Get yourself self-organized, work with some people you don't typically work with. Like-mindedness is the great enemy of leadership and change. Work with people who you don't normally work with. This conversation that we're having is a complex conversation. It's not simple, it's not complicated, it's complex. You know that little conundrum asks the question, what's the difference between baking a cake, sending a rocket to the moon, and raising a child? And the answer is, one is simple, one is complicated, and one is complex. Baking a cake, allegedly, still haven't figured it out. One is complicated, that's the rocket science. So basically the explanation is this. Baking a cake, pretty much anybody can do it. You don't need an expertise. Once you have a recipe, you can kind of muddle through and figure it out. All right? However, sending a rocket to a moon is something you want a rocket scientist involved in. Once they've cracked it, once they've cracked the science, it is, you can replicate it and you can scale it. Okay? So it's complicated. But raising a kid, I know presumably lots of you did it. And if you've done it more than once, you know that you can pretty much do the same thing with 2 kids and they go in completely opposite directions. Because it's emergent. It is not something that you can simplify, and it's not something that you can create a science around. It's an art form. It's when it's done at its best. But it's emergent. It's therefore complex. And when we talk about this stuff, we're in the realm of the complex. We're in the realm of the emergent. And therefore, a lot of it is not governable, So we're talking about a leadership that's very, very different to the leadership that would be required if you were project managing, sending a rocket to a moon, or you were, involved in overseeing the baking of a cake. I think it's really important that we state that, because otherwise the folk who are locked in the simple world or in the complicated world get really ticked off with the folks who kind of go, but this is complex. So this is complex. But in the context of that, what emerged through your discussions? What kinds of insights surfaced that you think might be worth sharing?
many things that the communities can do, less what institutions can do, and barely anything that we can do together.
Really? Okay. There's kind of it's that moment when you realize it's time to start thinking about that tomato farm, you know, in Texas somewhere. Okay, great. Okay, so beginning to see that there's a huge amount of possibility in this community space. Yeah. Okay, great.
I was talking about, I remember just us growing up, we grew up in a village in Norfolk. It wasn't a small village. The knowledge, so in that village, we all knew growing up that if you went to the violin teacher, you took a friend. It was just an unspoken word you went with it. We knew in the village who'd got mental health, even though we didn't label it mental health, we knew who had, and there were support networks just naturally constant. So how do we rebuild that?
Mm.
Way of 30 years ago, there's really strong memories of getting back in the village.
That's powerful. Paying attention to that question: how do we rebuild that? How do we affect a process of recovery? Not just individual recovery. With the recovery movement in terms of addiction and alcohol, and their whole narrative is around how can we personally recover. Actually, what we need to be thinking about is how can we recover the conditions for personal recovery, and that's the stuff you've talked about. Did anybody ever have an aunt or an uncle or a distant cousin who suffered with their nerves? You remember this expression? I grew up, I never quite knew what it meant, but everybody went, oh yeah. You know, it was a mandatory response. But somehow that person suffering with their nerves was in the community. And people muddled through and figured out in the complexity of that how to be useful. Yeah, that's great, thank you. The other thing that I'd pay attention to is how we do no harm to that space. I would contend that we haven't just neutrally disinvested in the space, but we've actively done harm to community space and created a huge amount of dependency. You know the concept in health, particularly in clinical health, of iatrogenesis? Yeah? So iatrogenesis means where you get the opposite of what you intend. The contraindicator, you know. Yeah. So every drug has a negative side effect, right? So when a doctor prescribes a set of pharmacological interventions, they say, this is what it will do for you, but watch out because here are the side effects. I was recently speaking to 80 social workers, and I said, so, this is kind of an opener, you know, so what are the negative side effects of social work these days? And they all kind of just looked at me. There are? So, you know, as professionals, we wear the mask of love. And the mask of love says, we can do no harm to you. We love you. We're here for you. You know, when everybody else has abandoned you, come to our bosom. We'll resource you. We'll fix you. We'll save you. And yet, the unintended consequence of that is you're inadequate. Your community is inadequate. Your family are seriously dysfunctional. But it's okay, because we've got programs for that. And then we wonder why our villages are now as disconnected and seemingly incompetent as they are. They're not disconnected, these things. So how can we also make sure that we do no harm, as well as maybe doing some recovery stuff and investing? Thank you. Any other thoughts, just even riffing on that, or musings?
Oh, yeah, we were saying that sort of within the community, things, when they happen, tend to be organic and they're left from within, and there's no boundaries. From agencies, there's frameworks, boundaries, very restrictive, all of that. But then we're saying if we're sort of doing something together, sometimes that structure or that guide might be helpful to something happening. So maybe that's something you can share. But yeah.
I think, following on from what you just said, I think it is really powerful in terms of not thinking about the person, but thinking about them in the context of their family in particular. And very often when you're paid to support someone, you focus on them and then only. And what we've heard from this morning, what you just said, is the power of actually looking around them and taking care and looking out for everyone else around them as well. And I think in our line of work, I've had a brainwave, hadn't I, on Friday when we were talking about, particularly for people with learning disabilities and their families. When the day centres closed, we all focused on the person and not really perhaps realising the absolute impact that had on their parents and families, that they lost a support network themselves that perhaps they'd had for 30 years and they now have nothing. And how we start to think that through and think about how can we extend the support to their families as well. Really important.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? You know, you can have a conversation with somebody about what their good life might look like, and they can say, well, for me, it's been involved in whatever, you know, an allotment. But if you're in a community where allotments died years ago, who picks that up? And there's something about that ecosystem of actually saying, you know, it's not very hard to do, is if we have a situation where, as well as having those conversations with folk in a very person-centered way, so that we get some clarity around what it is they want to do with their life, but also at the same time we're tending to the recovery of and the reseeding of associational space, they have a fighting chance of actually being able to use, if they have a personal budget, use their personal budget to do something other than just go to the pub and get lunch, which I think most people are doing. You know, so there's something about actually, it's not either or. We talk about community care, and actually, to be honest, or independent living. It's not independent living, it's lonely living. You know, people are being taken out of institutions and then put into communities, but they're not communities. They're neighbourhoods of disconnected, isolated people who leave at 9 o'clock, come home at whatever time they come home, and probably have their hobbies in some other part of the town or city or wherever it is.
I don't think there's such thing as independent really anyway, is there?
No.
We're interdependent.
Interdependent, exactly. And I think that's so important, that distinction. It's amazing how we peddle, and even personalisation. What we probably want to be talking about is communalisation budgets. You know, there's a situation recently where somebody was saying their son was really passionate about learning to paint. You know, so it's this kind of, it's the classic journey from let's find a meaningful activity that keeps him occupied. Not let's find a valuable role that keeps him, in a sense, validated, but let's find something that keeps him occupied. So, you know, they have a personal budget and the conversation turns to, well, we could actually pay somebody to come into the house and teach him how to paint. And, you know, for various reasons, that seems like a really good idea. And to their eternal credit, you know, when you do throw out a little bit of a disruptive question like, gee, I wonder how many other people in this neighbourhood have personal budgets? Or maybe don't have personal budgets, but would love to learn art. You remember earlier on you were saying you'd also love, Stephen, to have friends. Is there a way that you could use the money that benefits the community and Stephen together and allows those two things? And you can immediately see kind of a sparkle. Yeah, not in every instance, but, you know, in many. And people go, now it's no longer person-centered planning, it's community-centered planning with the person getting a life.
With my job.
And your job. Hey, bonus points.
I was just thinking about something that I came across a couple of weeks back, and we were looking at some of the things, and he'd become quite animated and engaged, and it was a review that we were involved with him, and he said something that nobody had ever really kind of picked up and heard before about what the starting point for actually supporting him being to do with the fact that he had really close relationships with his family, but he'd stopped them because nothing was changing in terms of the pressure he felt every time they were around, because they had learned to tell him that they wanted him to be better and to get well, and kind of was, you know, the pressure was on from them. And when we actually got to the end of it, we were talking about that the work was really with the family, helping the family to re-engage with him without, you know, without that stuff in it, and starting to build their relationship again from a very different starting point. And that's the work for the team, because that's the way that he will, you know, he will get a life that makes loads more sense to him, because that's the most centrally important thing to him. But we were kind of in this holding position of his family don't visit, they don't visit anymore because he doesn't want them to. Nowhere to go with it, you know. So it was, for me, it is that the community, we always should be looking back at the community in terms of what's it, the person themselves will see them, you know, what's the picture that they will see themselves fitting and feeling comfortable and able to be a part of.
And it's interesting in terms of measurement. You know, if Certitude want to think about, okay, I wish I had something I could draw. could I take that piece of paper there? Do we have a marker or something? Oh, no, it's greaseproof paper. I'll probably be able to paint it with words, it's fine. So if you imagine a circle, right, with 4 hemispheres, okay, so I personally think what's happening with most organizations that are working with people who are, let's just say, marginalized, for want of a less offensive label, is let's put them in the middle of this circle, right in the middle of the cross. So we're being person-centered, no doubt about it. But largely where we've gotten to over the last, I guess, 20 years or so, is most folk who have labels, particularly if they're multiple labels, are surrounded with other people who look like and have the same diagnostic labels as they have, paid people, and to a certain degree over the life course, immediate family members, largely their mother and father as they age. And the space, the hemisphere which has hardly any activity in it, is the hemisphere of non-paid professional related people who are diagnosed, right? So getting away from the diagnosis, getting away from the paid, getting away from the family into that space is a really useful way of measuring impact. So if you counted up on average across a life course, say even if you try to go back in the records, 20 years ago, the average person, let's not call them client, the average person that was served by organizations like yours would have had between 50 and 70 people in their lives. The vast majority of them were people with the same labels as they had, and largely other professional people were paid to service them. A way of measuring success is, are you reducing those numbers and increasing the number in this hemisphere here of ordinary folk who want to be in relationship with that person and in a reciprocal way are valuing their gifts? That's the measurement. Now what's really interesting is most of the money, most of the action, most of the evaluative frameworks are not interested in that space. So when they say prove that there's value in this hemisphere, what they're really saying is prove in the same way that you've proved in the other hemispheres that there's value, right? Instead of actually saying this is radical. What you're talking about now could actually create an alternative to a lot of these spaces, or actually create a very different dynamic, even disrupt an awful lot of the power bases, not just for professionals, but also maybe for some families. And that scares the heck out of people. So I think an awful lot of what we hear when we hear people talking about evidence is code for resistance and fear. Because actually the evidence is in. I mean, who in reasonable terms would say, prove to me that having a friend is a good thing? It doesn't make any sense. So you have to assume that what you're surfacing is resistance to change and fear around power loss. So I think the other thing that's really important to say here is this kind of style of leadership that we're talking about is leading by stepping back. It's sort of moving out of a space that maybe we've colonized for a while and giving people the opportunity to step up. And one of the most critical questions I think that we could ask ourselves when it comes to being in this space and being a leader in the space is, what have we not done this week to empower somebody to step in to their own agency? So we've been mostly trained, I think, to think about what have we done? What are we doing? What programs have we started? How did we fill our week? And what I'm encouraging you to do really is to think about what you're not going to do to be helpful. So what I'd like to do now is, again, let's go back into some group work and start thinking about what, as an organization, you're the leaders of the organization, so presumably there's a little bit of having to bring other people on this journey with you. But let's just focus on who's in the room for now. What, as an organization, based on your circle of influence, your sphere of influence, would you feel the organization needs to start doing and stop doing to grow relationships in this hemisphere that I'm calling you to pay attention to? Not more family programs, not more professional interventions, not more people segregated and aggregated by their pathology, but people in relationship, in community with other folk doing stuff that they enjoy. What are you not going to do to enable that to happen? And what are you going to start doing that will enable that to happen? And I'd like you to get in, again, another group of 3 with 2 other people that you haven't worked with up to now. Hopefully this is the start of a conversation, and probably, to be truthful, based on what I've heard about your organisation, it's not alone the start of a conversation, but it builds on a lot of conversations that are currently happening. Most, if not everybody in this room, are what I would call disruptive innovators. You've kind of figured out that reforming systems isn't where the change is at. It's about disrupting things, about not settling for the status quo, about trying to create new possibilities, particularly that relocate the authority away from you and into the hands of people who for years have been told they have no authority at all. That's what defines you in my mind. That's what I will take away from meeting you folks. And when I talk to other people, I'll say this is an organization, I think, who are intent about relocating authority away from themselves and into the hands of the people they serve. And that makes them unique. When I listen to these people, they don't use I statements, they use we statements. They are attending to the space that most other people just want to colonize and provide services in. Right? That may be overgenerous, but I don't think it is. Just eavesdropping as I do. That's my sense of it. So hopefully that feedback is useful to you. But continue to remember something. Authority never gets relocated by accident. Right? It gets relocated by intentionality. So we can't ever rest on our laurels. We have to absolutely muster up every single day the answer to the question, how am I going to relocate authority today? Not abdicate responsibility, relocate authority. So what is it that you're going to start doing that you're not currently doing to relocate authority, building on what it is that you're already at, you're already involved in? What mischief making are you going to engage in next? Any thoughts? No right or wrong.
Asking the right questions at the right sequence. Because, yeah, I think we're not always asking the right question. But sometimes you do, but then you then said about the right sequence, which makes sense to me. Because you could get the answers, but if they're not in the right sequence, then you're getting it wrong again.
And kind of thinking about, shifting it almost from right and wrong to what questions could we ask, right? How could we craft? How could we become the crafters of questions as opposed to the crafter of answers? How do we notice when a question resonates for somebody and moves somebody on? And how do we find a way of passing that on to other people? That's great. Thank you. So what else? What other reckless acts of community building are you going to commit?
I think we talked about challenging, we're going to challenge more, and be a bit braver, especially with commissioners and people that sort of hold the strings. Don't know how we're going to do it, but
one of the things that we've started taking on is thinking about what's our readiness criteria before we work with commissioners. Just recently had an interview where the commissioner got on and said, we want to interview you before we take you on. I said, that's fine, because I'd really like to interview you as well. And they said, what? So what's our readiness criteria before we partner with investors? When would we say no, even if the money is very, very significant? Because they're not ready. The investment won't be a value-based investment. That's a big challenge. Yeah. But fun. Oh, man, is it fun. So what else? Asking different questions, being prepared to challenge ourselves, but also other people, to stand for something that's more profoundly about being citizen-led. What else are we going to do?
I was thinking about I was struck by something you said earlier about the single issue thing, and not just thinking about stuff as a single issue thing. So in terms of sometimes thinking we have some work we need to achieve and blah, blah, blah. Actually, I know, for example, we were thinking about peer support for people with learning disabilities. And I've been thinking, how can we kind of, get people what they need and plan with people and so on. But actually, maybe shifting that to thinking these people are local citizens in their community. You know, what if we found some other local citizens and then just got people to talk and just see what came out of it?
That's great. That's great. That is so radical, right? It seems simple, but it's so radical. And you can imagine a situation at a neighbourhood level where right about the same time a certain serendipity comes to pass, and you have, because of an event like today, you have maybe a health commissioner and social care folk and maybe some people who are interested in policing kind of getting to the same point and saying, why are we paying folk to just focus on their particular area? Why couldn't we create neighbourhood pooled budgets that would actually allow us to share the salary of one person who doesn't follow any of our agendas, just connects? You know, so there's all kinds of possibilities open, as well as changing our own practice, starting to really think about how could we disrupt? How could we disrupt and innovate and actually say unapologetically, this is, as an organization, what we're going to do. Yeah, yeah, to get better outcomes that people themselves drive. Yeah, that's great. So you could start seeing the connections between different questions, disruptive innovation, challenging, beginning to change our practice. They all link in an ecosystem. And there are other people who aren't in the room that we could bring into the room. Or if they don't want to come to a meeting, why have a meeting when you can have a party? We could throw a party and have the conversation that way. So that's great, thank you. Any other closing thoughts before we wrap up?
I think for me there's something about stop doing, because again in my own kind of personal experience is about I've always tried to set up the systems and to bring in some order and have a plan, and actually that may not work the best for some of the teams that I'm currently sort of managing or leading on, and allowing them to just flourish in a way that kind of flows quite naturally and grows organically. So certainly stepping back and just watching and observing and learning from everybody else.
That's great. Yeah, so not trying to manage, everything. Obviously some things need, it's fantastic. Any other thoughts around what you're going to stop doing? Thanks for reminding me, actually. I'd forgotten that. And it was great you didn't let yourself off the hook. So anybody else, anything that you kind of...
We were talking about the tendency for us to hold the bubble around people, and we're going to start bursting the bubble and make it be very much more open. And the other thing that we're kind of moving towards was around letting go of control over certain community-based things, and actually supporting the community to take back the ownership of some of the community-based activities, and maybe skill sharing a bit. We could offer, we've got a huge amount of skills in the organisation, so we could act in a very diverse way rather than just organisational, this is our trade way. We could actually just hunt out what capacities we've got and offer back to the community, so this bit of sharing starts to happen.
That's great. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, sharing of the skills and the buildings and a whole range of different things. If you did an asset map, fantastic.
We actually had a really similar discussion about kind of taking away support in its traditional sense, in that you think more creatively when you have a limit there, which is nothing. So if you take away the idea of supporting someone, you have to look at alternatives. It's like if you're planning an event like today, say, and we say, well, the budget is zero, you've got to think really creatively about how you create the event. And we sort of said, well, what if we took away all the support? You'd have to look at the alternatives, and you'd be forced to think creatively and look at other options. So that was kind of our radical discussion.
And wrestling with those dilemmas is actually where the next chapter of your organisation will be written. You know, and because we can't sort of say this is a model and therefore we're just going to follow it blindly. Anything that we do butts up against the real world. And good community building accepts the world as it is, not as it should be, so we can create a world as it is meant to be, you know, as it could potentially be. And inevitably that means wrestling with all kinds of dilemmas. You know, when do we step back, when do we not? Is there a transition? You know, is there a point at which maybe we need to put in some community building resource to get the community ready to see it has assets, and then actually, you know, so all of that stuff. But that's part of the fun of this, I think, is actually figuring all of that out. I just wanted to finish with a story, if I may, and then I'll hand over to Ashley to close us out. Because we have to be back. I think the guys have to be back at 3:30. So just a very brief story, and then just to say thank you all. So the story is about a wise woman who was invited to give guidance to a village in crisis. As the story goes, the village elders had spent a long time trying to figure out how they'd resolve the problem that the village was going through, but they couldn't. They just couldn't figure out a solution. So they all agreed that they would invite this wise woman from a neighbouring village some days away to come and advise them. So after a few days of travelling, she arrived in the village, and she sat with the village elders, and they told her what the problem was. And after listening very intently, she said to them, "Can I just ask you a question, gentlemen?" This is the asking the question piece. She said, can I just check with you, this crisis, this problem the village has, is it just peculiar to grey-haired men over the age of 65? Or does it actually affect the entire village? And they kind of, rather embarrassed, said, well, it obviously affects the entire village, but we are the people who've been elected by the village to represent them, and therefore we speak on their behalf. And she said, well, that's fine, but given that you can't come up with a solution, that isn't going to quite cut the mustard. So could I see the entire village? If I'm going to give advice to the entire village, then I need to be with the entire village. So they all kind of scuttled off, and they mobilized man, woman, and child, and brought everybody under a cedar tree. And the woman stood up in front of everyone, and she said, you know, you probably know this. You look like savvy people to me. So the truth of the matter is, as an outsider, I'm not going to tell you anything that you don't already know. And she kind of looked at them very inquisitively, and she said, you know that, don't you? And they all kind of nodded in agreement. And she said, well, that's good. Given that you agree that I'm not going to tell you anything you don't already know, can I ask you a question? Do you know what it is I'm going to tell you? And they all looked back at her and said, well, obviously, if we knew what you were going to tell us, we wouldn't have invited you in to give us guidance. We don't. And she said, well, look, if you don't know what you know, I can't help you. And she left. And the village elders kind of sat down that evening, and they tried to figure out what had just happened. It was a bit like, you know, this is talk about being mugged. They felt like they'd been mugged. And they concluded that what had happened was that the villagers had revealed their ignorance, right, to the wise woman. And so they decided that the best thing they could do as the leaders of this village was to bring the entire village back together and give out to them. Right? And they said, basically, we're going to bring this woman back. Don't know if we're going to get her back, but we're going to try. We're going to try and get her back, because she's got the answer to our problem. And for goodness sake, the next time she asks you a question, make sure you give her the right answer. So the woman came back a second time at their invitation, and she stood in front of the entire village, who sat again under the same cedar tree. And she said, you know, I'm not going to tell you anything you don't already know. So can I ask you a question? They knew what was coming. She said, do you know what it is I'm going to tell you? And of course, they'd been warned. So they said, yes. And she said, well, that's just fantastic. Then you don't need me. And she left. Now the village elders realized this woman was messing with their head. And they were angry with the wrong people. They should have been angry with her. So they sat down right into the wee hours of the morning, plotting, conniving, mischief-making, and planning. And they came up with a really cunning strategy to deal with this rather wise woman. And they invited her back a third time. But now they had a plan. So they knew what she was going to do. She stood, and absolutely true to form, she said, you know, I'm not going to tell you anything you don't already know. So can I ask you a question? Do you know what it is I'm going to tell you? And right at that moment, one half of the village said yes, exactly at the same time as the other half said no. That kind of stumped her. She'd never experienced, I mean, she'd been using this quite a lot over the years, you know. She'd never experienced that before. And she thought, that's clever. And then she stopped, and being wise, she took a deep breath and she thought. And she said, you know, in truth, this is the best of all possible outcomes. So can those who say no please speak to those who said yes? And she left, and she never came back again. So I thought that would be a good way to end. Thank you all very much. Thank you.